Hey, welcome back to Morning Joe. With us now, acclaimed writer and journalist Tom Ricks. He's back with his new book out today. It's titled First Principles, What America's Founders Learned from the Greeks and Romans and How That Shaped Our Country. Also, we're honored to have with us best-selling author and historian Ron Chernow, because we're talking about George Washington today. And, of course, Ron wrote an extraordinary biography of George Washington. Tom, I want to start with you because you're studying our founders and actually how they studied. And we have James Madison deciding to break tradition and going to the radical University of New Jersey, Princeton, and then Jefferson, of course, William and Mary, and what he learned in Paris, and Adams at Harvard. But George Washington, he had a degree from Fort Necessity and the French and Indian War. Explain how his challenges in the French and Indian War may have been his greatest education.
You know, it's such a nice spot in America to have a morning TV show sit and discuss the French and Indian War. One of my favorite wars that nobody ever talks about. The French and Indian War, it's a colonial fight. The Americans are fighting with the British against the French and Indians, kind of over who's going to take over North America. Washington goes in, helps start the war, actually, and then gets his butt kicked. He surrenders for the only time in his life, a place called Fort Necessity. And he winds up then in another big battle, Braddock's defeat, the biggest military encounter on North American soil to that point, in which the Indians fought really intelligently, having gone and reconnaissanced the Americans and the British coming in for weeks. The First Peoples is the way I prefer to refer to them. The First Peoples fighters really understood warfare in a different way. And I think Washington learned there's more than one way to fight a war, as he saw the British suffer this terrible defeat. And that really helped him 20 years later in the American Revolution. He had seen people born in America defeat a European army. He had seen that you could fight different ways, that you should listen to dissenting voices and advance reconnaissance, getting scouts out, understanding the people and the terrain is essential. And these are all things he eventually learned to use during the Revolution. I got to say, he didn't start the Revolution well. He spent his first couple of years in the war as a pretty conventional thinker. The difference was the British stayed conventional, and he began to adjust and change.
Well, of course, we seldom talk about it today, but he was harshly criticized by John Adams during the war. He was harshly criticized by his own military secretary. He was harshly criticized, Ron, time and time again. But what your wonderful biography of Washington shows us the human side, and what you and Tom both touch upon is, and I wrote the quote down here, that Washington was a man capable of constant self-improvement. And Tom shows that as well in his book, how he started on the offensive in 1775, 1776. Then he decided to do a war of posts, and then that failed. And then he learned to fight like the Indians had fought against him in the French and Indian War.
You know, there were probably, Joe, other generals who were greater in terms of military strategy or tactics, but they all got sidetracked in terms of personal feuds and jockeying for power. Washington had what I would call an inspired simplicity. He always kept his eye on his ultimate goal. And some of the other founders, we see their brilliance in the moment. With George Washington, we see him carrying these enormous historic tasks over the 8 years of the Revolutionary War and then over the 8 years of his presidency. And he was not only harshly criticized during the war, but, you know, we've just had a presidential campaign in which there was a lot of discussion about conspiracy theories. And when Washington was president, at first he was a political untouchable, but then that wore off after a point. And he was accused of everything from plotting to restore the British monarchy to having been a British double agent throughout the Revolutionary War. And at first he decided that he wouldn't dignify these crackpot ideas with a response. But then in his second term as president, he wrote a very interesting letter in which he said that he realized that if you drip water on a stone, if it drips on the stone long enough, it will leave a mark. And that if a lie is repeated often enough, people will begin to believe it. And then he began to respond to his critics. But up until that time, he always tried to kind of stay above the partisan fray.
Yeah, Tom, one of the things I love the most about Washington's generalship in First Principles is he begins by, and by the way, there should be management classes taught about Washington's generalship for years to come. But Tom, you talk about his utter contempt for militia members. At the beginning of the war, he couldn't discipline them. He couldn't get them to fight traditional battles. But you described, Tom, how the war went on. He decided to use his troops as they could best be used. And you said, and Washington eventually said, OK, let them fight in their towns. Let them fight in their villages. Let them fight. Go out, harass the British, and then bleed back into their villages and towns. And that may be the best effective way to actually frustrate the British. And in fact, he was right, wasn't he?
He was, and you're right. He comes into Boston, having been told, create this American army. And he's never been up there, and he's kind of stunned by how dirty and unruly the New Englanders are. They're not deferential to wealth and power in a way he had grown to expect in living in Virginia. And he also wants the militiamen to fight like conventional, regular forces, which is not a good idea. They're not trained, they're not prepared to face these terrifying bayonet charges by British regulars. But he eventually realizes, and this is kind of the axiom of the hammer and the saw. If you're trying to hammer using a saw, is it the instrument's fault, the tool's fault, or is it your fault? He learns, use them for what they're good for. And as you say, militiamen were good if they fought near their homes, in areas they knew, woods they were familiar with, people they knew who they could trust, where they could get intelligence.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.